Hello, and welcome to CAP's second podcast episode. Today, we'll talk about domestic violence as a whole. But to begin with, I want to take a moment and I want you to think of the phrase domestic violence. As you think of this phrase, I want you to really focus in on what pops into your brain when you think of the phrase domestic violence. So I'm just going to give you a couple seconds to think about that. All right. I could almost bet that many of us think of something like physical abuse, right? So bruises, scratches, maybe even broken bones. And I'm sure, unfortunately, a lot of us envision a male perpetrator. Maybe not, but I'm sure a lot of us do. The term domestic violence is really an umbrella term used to encompass several types of abuse, and it's not just physical. And no, men aren't always perpetrators, but we can save that discussion for a whole different podcast on its own. So, throughout this episode, we'll touch on the different types of domestic violence, what it looks like, sounds like, and take a deeper dive and identify different types of abuse in hopes to proactively avoid these issues. So, hopefully, by the end, you'll be able to identify those subcategories of domestic violence. All right, so to start off, the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence states that DV is the willful intimidation, physical assault, battery, sexual assault, and or abusive behavior as part of a systemic pattern of power and control perpetrated by one intimate partner against another. So you may also hear, as we're discussing through the following episodes and things, the term IPV, which stands for intimate partner violence, being used quite often. And while DV, which is domestic violence, and IPV, intimate partner violence, do overlap quite a bit, there is a slight area that does set the two apart. So we're going to address that before moving on. So for my brain to kind of separate and understand the difference between the two, I like to picture a house. And anyone living in that house with someone who exhibits abusive behavior is experiencing domestic violence. So, for example, domestic violence may happen between, two roommates that live under the same roof, spouses, a mother to a father to a mother, or the parents to the children, parents to grandparents, maybe vice versa. Whereas intimate partner violence is more, that more specifically refers to two intimate partners who do not live under the same roof or household. A lot of times I think of, teens, young adults, college-age people who are in an intimate relationship where one partner exhibits abusive behavior, but the two individuals do not live together. This could also go for more mature couples who are in the dating stage but are not living together yet. So it really just depends, but the biggest difference is, are they in an intimate relationship and living together or not? So hopefully that helps you kind of understand the difference between the two, but you may hear them used interchangeably just depending on the situation. Before diving all the way in, I also want to mention that I refer to those who have experienced domestic violence as DV victims, and it really does just depend on the situation. So if I'm talking about maybe a situation, after that person has been able to leave the abuse, I typically refer to them as survivors. If I'm kind of given a scenario of when someone is, in a situation experiencing the abuse, I tend to refer to them as victims. So just to kind of put that out there, whenever you're speaking to a survivor or victim of domestic violence, it's definitely best to ask them how they want to be referred to or which term they best identify with. But I did want to just throw that out there, that you'll kind of hear me use them interchangeably, just depending, which is fine. So some of the main types of domestic violence that I want to touch on in this episode are as follows. So obviously we know that there is physical, sexual, emotional, verbal, economic, and psychological. We're going to kind of combine some of those together throughout the rest of the episode, and I'll try to piece some of them apart as well. So there's also stalking, which we'll touch on in a completely different episode. I like to kind of give that one, a standalone moment because there's a lot that goes behind that separately as well. So to begin with, we're going to touch on the physical violence. And, this is, again, what initially comes to many people's minds when thinking of domestic violence. So, physical violence can be identified as hitting, shoving, grabbing, slapping, kicking, punching, choking, smothering, and many more acts. But some of the ways physical violence may show are even more in depth than that. So, an abuser may change their posture to intimidate a victim. Many victims do report knowing that an explosive behavior of some sort is about to occur just by the way their abuser is, holding their posture or changing their posture. When an abuser wants to maintain control, which we know is the goal for all abusers, they will want themselves to feel bigger and for the victim to feel smaller. Additionally, with changing posture, this can cause a victim to become or at least feel physically trapped. So if they're in a situation, they're, there might be the chance that they're trying to make themselves feel bigger to physically trap the victim in an area where they can't get away. Or it could be more of a mental thing. It really does just depend. So I think physical abuse is the easiest form of abuse to identify. Like I said at the beginning, it's kind of one of those things that when we think of the word domestic violence, a lot of times for many people, it's the first thing that pops into our brain, right? We know what physical injuries look like. We know what bruises look like and things like that. So I wanted to hit on that one real quick, touch on that, and then we're going to move on to the other ones. Another type of abuse that abusers commonly use is sexual abuse. So, sexual abuse involves unwanted touch, sexual interaction, comments, jokes, attacking certain body parts, requiring the victim to dress a certain way, pouting if they're not getting what they want, affairs, and many more things under that. I think many people initially think of unwanted touch or action when thinking of sexual abuse, but it is much more than that. Also, a victim may experience verbal abuse, and this is one that we're really going to kind of dive into because this is one that, a lot of us think of, but I feel that these last several ones that we're going to touch on today are commonly, I want to say, overlooked, or, we tend to think about the first two a little bit more. So, when an abuser is verbally abusive, you will see them putting the victim down, name calling, shouting, swearing, threatening, using harmful or abusive jokes, oftentimes giving the silent treatment, belittling, controlling certain conversations, and blaming. These are only some ways that you may identify verbal abuse. There are, of course, many more. Verbal abuse is a type of emotional abuse. So the abuser is using words they know will negatively affect the victim emotionally or mentally. And oftentimes, verbal abuse is said to precede physical abuse, but not always. So just because someone's experiencing verbal abuse doesn't mean that physical is always next, but a lot of times it can. You can have verbal abuse and never experience physical abuse. And it's crucial to note that verbal abuse and all of other forms of abuse are just as harmful and traumatizing as physical. So, verbal abuse can also be subtle. It's not always easily detectable, and sometimes it's just the opposite. It's very hard to detect. When someone's experiencing verbal abuse, they may feel afraid of the abuser, like they must walk on eggshells around their own house or around that person. They might be hesitant to go into public with that person in fear of a verbal outburst or humiliation of some sort. Victims usually feel inferior or ashamed about who they are due to the constant verbal abuse. And abusers overreact to small issues, resulting in large fights. And sadly, verbally abusive people will hide it from everywhere else. And what I mean by this is when the victim and abuser are around other people, the abuser may act like a completely different and innocent person. You'll see this happening a lot when the abuser is someone who is highly thought of in the community. A lot of times, victims have a hard time kind of getting the message out of who that person really is behind closed doors because the abuser is, such a well thought of person and they're, fearful of what others might think or how, that comes across. So definitely keep that in mind too. There are many reasons why people engage in verbal abuse. An abuser may have a family history of it, past experiences, personality and mental disorders can also play a huge role as well. And it's important to remember that the underlying goal for the abuser is to retain power and control while making the victim feel bad for who they are. So even though, maybe that abuser has a history of verbal abuse or they were verbally abused growing up and that's all that they know, that's still not an excuse for you to experience that because of their past experiences. So just please know that. Next, we can discuss emotional and psychological abuse. So, although these are two different forms of abuse, you'll see that they kind of do go hand in hand. They overlap a good bit. So, I'll probably hit on emotional abuse the most, and then there's one type of psychological abuse specifically that I really want to talk about afterwards. But emotional abuse comes in many forms, right? And these forms of abuse are highly damaging. You hear many people say things like sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will not harm me. I remember that being like such a phrase when you're younger and your parents want you to not be bothered by what mean kids at school say, right? But there has been a lot of research conducted that shows just how long lasting words actually are when it comes to trauma. So, think about it. We can all think of a time, whether that be in recent years or back into childhood, that someone, maybe even, with innocent intentions, but someone said something that emotionally hurt us in some kind of way to some extent. And you still think about that often. So you can imagine the damage and trauma that comes with repeated emotional abuse that you can't just walk away from or just escape. Some signs of emotional abuse are humiliation in front of others, using insulting names to make the victim feel useless or worthless, getting angry in a way that is frightening, threatening harm not only to the victim but also to their loved ones and pets. Abusers may threaten to harm themselves if the victim doesn't comply with whatever it is they want, using phrases like, if I can't have you, then no one can, or acting jealous or constantly accusing the victim of cheating. Abusers want their victims' needs to seem less important than their own. So they'll often change the subject, whether the victim brings up conversation around something they feel is important. Um, Another form of emotional abuse that arguably, kind of overlaps with psychological abuse is gaslighting. And this is one that I really want to hit on because I feel like it's been such a buzz term used here lately. So I know gaslighting, that's a term that is well known, but I don't know that many people know where it originates from and what it actually means. So, to talk about its origin, kind of as it relates to what we're talking about here, there was a play that was written and put out there in the late 1930s titled Gaslight. And so later on, that exact play was turned into a movie in 1944 with the same name, Gaslight. And in this film, the husband kind of subtly over time dims gaslights around his couple's home. And then he denies his actions to his wife. And over time, his wife is convinced that she is imagining this, and she eventually begins to doubt her own perceptions. She even reflects a previous family history of mental illness. And this movie as a whole is a great example of gaslighting, and many abusers will use this method to cause the victim to question their own perception of reality and sanity. So we'll be talking about gaslighting a lot in one of the lunch and learns that I have coming up. So if you stay tuned to the end, you'll hear more about that. But some examples of gaslighting are belittling valid emotions to make them seem like nothing, discounting achievements, withholding information, using false apologies as a distraction from a certain behavior, minimizing feelings, and questioning someone's memories or recollections. Gaslighting can be used in relationships, in the workforce, at a doctor's office, and really anywhere that anyone can speak verbally. Um, I like to bring awareness to this form of psychological abuse because many people use the term gaslighting, like I said, but I don't know that they really know, what it means and where it originates from. And I do think it is kind of interesting information to see that film had such a big part in, originating that word. Lastly, I want to touch on economic or financial abuse. Um, Abusers use financial abuse more than we, realize and recognize. So, financial abuse can be identified as the abuser controlling, maintaining, or withholding financial resources. So, many victims who experience this type of abuse are prevented from working to bring their own income. So think about it. When we're growing up and as kids, we always want to be older. And when I was little, I would often think, I can't wait to have my own job, or I can't wait to have my own car so that I can get my own job and I can pay for my own gas and I can go wherever I want, whenever I want, buy things that I want. And so a lot of times we associate this, money with freedom. So it does make sense as to why, financial abuse is so prevalent, and when one of the main goals, like I said, for abusers is to gain and maintain power and control. Along with preventing a victim from getting or keeping a job, an abuser may ruin their victim's credit history, feel entitled to their assets, and interfere with finances altogether, stripping the victim from that freedom. And, I think a lot of times when we think of domestic violence, we think of, partners, romantic partners in a relationship. But this can also happen a lot with parents and children as well, too. Parents that have children who are growing up and starting to become financially, free and independent. So think about that there as well. It plays a lot in a bunch of different types of relationships. So I know that was kind of quick-ish, but my goal for today was to briefly, very briefly, touch on the different forms of domestic violence and abuse. I think it's important for us to understand that abuse is more than bruises and yelling and threats, right? So I think, the sooner that we're able to identify the different types of abuse, I think we'll all be able to help prevent the spread of domestic violence. And like I said earlier, we could really go super into depth into all of the different types of abuse. But like I said, my goal for, just our second podcast, I really wanted to kind of highlight and briefly explain some of the different, types. But moving forward, we will have a lot of different educational opportunities coming up for you guys if you're interested to join in on, whether that be a lunch and learn or community presentations or more podcasts where we'll talk about more in-depth topics around domestic violence. But before we end, I do want to share some upcoming events that CAP has going on. But first and foremost, we're thrilled to continue sharing about our 40th anniversary celebration, Adult Prom. Our tickets are on sale now, and so if you want to buy your ticket, you can visit our website, Instagram, that will lead you to a link to Eventbrite, or you can head straight to Eventbrite, to get the ticket for our adult prom, which is on Friday, October 20th from 7 to 11 p.m. Dinner is included with your ticket purchase. So once you purchase that ticket, you are good to go. We definitely want to advertise this event to, well, everybody, but also, seniors who graduated high school, maybe in 2020, right at the pandemic, and didn't get a prom. This would be a great opportunity for those individuals to come out and kind of get to have that experience that was lost. We would really love to see all of you there. Also, CAP will be at the Together We Rise, Charles County's annual recovery celebration on September 23rd. That is a Saturday. On October 3rd, I will be holding a lunch and learn on sexual and reproductive coercion. So stay tuned to our social media for more details on how to sign up and when to sign up. I'll be posting those within the next couple weeks. On Wednesday, October 4th, we will have a table set up at Charles County Community Day at the Regency Furniture Stadium from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. We're also attending the Indian Head Senior Center Fall Fest on Thursday, October 5th. CAP is also a vendor at La Plata's Fall Festival in La Plata from 12 to 3. And on the following weekend, We will be at the Nanjamoy Heritage Day from 11:30 to 3 p.m. CAP is also holding a couple of presentations with Teen Court on the 17th and 18th of October. So stay tuned for more details coming up about that as well. And all the rest of the good things. This is all for now. I will see you, or you will hear me next time. Thank you.